Hello, this is Benjamin Boyce. Today's guest is Jamie Shupe, who is a retired U.S. Army soldier. In 2016, Jamie had his gender legally changed to non-binary. We get into that court decision and its implications, and then Jamie shares his story about becoming trans and then detransitioning. And then he shares his views on transgenderism, which are among the strongest that I've showcased in this series on gender and sexuality. Now, this series is not designed to showcase one single view on these matters, but rather an array of experiences and views, couched not in that binary combativeness of agreement or disagreement, but rather just that simple human act of sharing the experiences of what one has gone through and how those experiences have shaped their views on life. That said, here's Jamie Shupe. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for wanting to talk. I was recommended to speak with you by somebody who commented, I believe, on one of the detransition videos.
Yeah, me desisting has kind of been making the news.
Oh yeah.
In small ways, nothing like when I first became non-binary. It was like that was 10 days of nonstop media attention, and it went on for 18 months. And since I've desisted, the only people that really want to talk about it are the conservatives and the religious folks.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess some of the, what we could call the gender critical feminists, have you seen any interest from them?
Oh, they have like totally embraced me on this. I mean, beyond my wildest dreams, it's been totally wonderful to have so much support from them.
And
Yeah,
you mentioned when you went non-binary, there was a lot of media attention. What year was that?
2016, the
Okay.
summer. Yeah, I went to court on June 10th, and I walked out of court, went to Starbucks and bought a latte, and by the time I came home, my whole screen was blown up with little bubbles from
Huh.
reporters going, can we interview you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And why do you think that was such a big deal? What was the precedent that was set by that? Because
Well, I mean,
this was like the U.S. government decided to create another category.
no, what I mean, basically, throughout the entire history of the United States, nobody has ever been legally declared as something other than male or female. So me getting a judge to do that was mind blowing for
Mm.
lots of folks, lawyers, the LGBT community. Everybody was just blown away about that, and especially by the way I went about doing it as well.
Mm-hmm. Which was how?
So basically, I had reached out to folks like Lambda Legal and the ACLU and even some other attorneys and said, hey, this is what I want to do. Will somebody support me on this? And like the ACLU and never even responded to me. Lambda said no.
Mm.
A lot of the lawyers said no. They didn't even want to attempt such a thing. And I found a gay attorney, a gay male attorney in Portland, who was one of the lead attorneys on same-sex marriage in Oregon. And I approached him, and yeah, and he said yes, and it turned out to be really simple.
Why was it so simple? Like, was it just a straightforward petition kind of thing?
I mean, he literally took a sex change petition, one that's normally used, sucked it into Photoshop, and did a cutout job on the male and female, typed in non-binary, and filed it with the court. And we had an agreement for $350 an hour for legal fees, and if it if it turned into appeals and all that, I mean, he was basically giving me a line of credit because I mean I'm not like a super rich person or anything. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, so he filed this thing in April. We went to the hearing in June, and the judge just merely signed it.
Oh.
So I mean, my legal bill for this landmark court decision was $1,056, which kind of that kind of blew everybody away too.
Huh. So
But
what?
there's
No, continue, please. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, there was, one little dark wrinkle in all of this. I had been told after the thing was filed, I was kind of running around like in a nervous wreck, going like, okay, I'm going to get sex change letters from my doctors, and bring all the evidence. We're going to show up like the army, we're going to be so big nobody wants to even fight us. And he was like, no, Jamie, don't worry about this. We got this. I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, well, the judge has a transgender child. So, I mean, I think that is basically the reason that I won. I think, I've come to think that she wasn't only validating me, that she was also validating her child in the process.
And
Uh,
what are your feelings on this now that you're
um,
desisting or have desisted?
as far as the court thing or overall, or
I guess
where,
let's start with the court thing, and then probably just present like a biography of like your transition and detransition, so people have a kind of it in their minds.
yeah, the court thing has just kind of eaten at me the whole time. Um, yeah, I felt like I cheated. I felt like the judge should have recused herself. And yeah, I mean, it kind of traces back to my military history. Like early in my career, I was on this international march team, and we went to Holland and we competed. We marched 100 miles in like a competition, a NATO kind of thing. And the lieutenant in charge of the team had us fill our rucksacks with styrofoam instead of the 22 pounds we were supposed to be carrying. So yeah, every day of the 4 days, we did 25 miles a day. Every day we won. And I was like, I don't ever want to cheat again.
Hmm.
I mean, I was just this little peon who had just come in the army. But yeah, I mean, it really shaped me about the cheating thing. And I felt that same way with this court thing about, her having the transgender kid. And, I went into the thing where I couldn't lose. Yeah. So,
Hmm.
yeah. So that has been eating at me, ever since then.
Well, from your perspective now, what is the importance of this third category then, or this non-binary category, in the legal system, and then in like I guess the general cultural milieu?
I've kind of changed my thinking on it. I went into it thinking that, I was helping people. That, okay, so the reason the whole non-binary thing came about, we should really start there, is because, prior to that, I had transitioned into being a female. And I had ultimately reached the conclusion after a couple of years that, I'm not really a female. I should have never transitioned to being a female. And how do I get myself out of this mess? And the non-binary thing became the mechanism to do just that.
Mm-hmm.
And, because I'm faced with that situation where you hear about with the kids. They've went around and they've told everybody they're the opposite sex, and everybody has supported them. Then all of a sudden they're changing their mind. So it's like, what do I do here? Do I commit suicide? Do I just tell everybody the whole thing was a mistake? How do I get myself out of this mess? And so I came up with the non-binary thing as a way to do that. The a lot of transitions do flame out and people do commit suicide, and I kind of pictured it as a landing zone for people like me, and that was a big part of my motivation. I mean, but as far as the legal folks, they had been wanting to do this for years, but nobody had ever succeeded at it.
So, in my speaking with the young women from the Peak Resilience Project, a couple of them have mentioned that the they, or entering into the they, is this middle zone. And it's a zone that they enter in before they transition and then after they transition. There's this buffer zone where they don't commit.
Hmm.
It, it doesn't seem like a permanent category. It seems like a position in between. It seems like there is no such thing as non-binary. Non-binary is making a binary between a binary and then establishing another binary, like between male female, and then just creating another axis of binary. But you think of it? Have you thought of it? Do people think of it as a permanent location? Because it seems like
Yeah,
a transitory location. And what does it
yeah. I mean,
mean to be non-binary?
it's kind of in a lot of ways it's a cop out, but there is people who actually adopt that identity and they stay there. I mean, I think Kate Bornstein, how do you pronounce that?
I do not
Yeah,
know.
That's one of the more famous trans people.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think they've been genderqueer for probably like 20 some years now.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, I mean, it is kind of this space, and that was another piece of the pie here. Okay, so when I was a female, living as a female, of course, the rad femmes would beat up on people like me and tell me I wasn't really a woman. Well, okay, so going to the non-binary space allowed me to basically carry on as living as a woman in sorts, but without being classified as a female.
Hmm.
So what can you really say about me if I'm doing stereotypical female things, but I'm
Hmm.
not doing it under a female identity?
Yeah.
So that was kind of a piece of it too.
So in in effect, it could be that a non-binary designation or even just a trans designation
Hmm.
would allow for some compromise between radical feminists and their worries about males taking over their sports, taking over the restrooms. It might lead to some sort of precedent where we can build this third category for certain instances where females want to preserve their status as females and not cede to natal males certain advantages, or I guess lose at track races in
Yeah,
a
I think
way.
that nails it really well. And historically, there has been a third gender. Okay, if you look in India and places in Asia, the
Mm-hmm.
mixes, I believe it's pronounced as mixes in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean there's all these. It goes way back into ancient history. But the difference with a lot of these folks are, they did this stuff, but they didn't identify as women. They were, they tended to be like gay male communities and things of that nature. They weren't running around going like, see, I'm really a female,
Mm-hmm.
which is the stuff that pisses off the feminists.
Yeah.
So that was kind of my little mindset too. Is like, well,
Mm-hmm.
I just restored the third gender to North America.
Hmm.
Yeah. So I was kind of like high on my own thing.
Yeah. So in a sense, it seems like now, and we can talk about like how you feel about now. It seems like now you kind of you doubt that or you have negative views for it. But there does seem to be some benefit to having this precedent or this third category of gender and normalizing that to a certain extent where the fetishization of it doesn't go overboard. I'm a little worried about the whole two-spirit thing, especially
Hmm.
on college campuses where people just self-ID as that because it makes them special. It gives them those extra special points that they need in order to get ahead or get an edge on the competition in a social sphere and stuff. But if we normalize it to such an extent that it's not this thing that people can abuse on a social level, it's just something that's accepted and passé, then it could possibly have a good effect. But that said, what are your negative views on it now, and what do you think is the problematics of the
Okay.
non-binary?
Well, one piece of this where it would be a positive is if you do it as a quote genderless person. Excuse me, I've got asthma, so you got to bear with my voice thing here.
That's fine.
Okay, so if you're doing it as quote genderless, you're not saying that you're not forgetting that you have a biological sex. You're
Okay.
just like I said, you're just operating as a genderless person. That has a benefit. But when you get sucked into all the stuff of like what I was doing of like, okay, so I've got a male body and I've got a female gender identity.
Mm-hmm.
So you mold these two together and that makes me non-binary and I'm a special snowflake. I'm the third sex. That sort of thing is harmful with this.
And why is it
Um,
harmful? Why do you think it's harmful to the individual and to the society?
because it's like when I was, as classified as a female, I can, they'll tell me that I wasn't really changing my sex. But then what do? I go down to the DMV and I change my sex.
Yeah.
That stuff starts getting a little confusing and you end up really damaged by that. I certainly did.
Okay. Yeah. So let's get into that then. I guess we should talk about like your history and what prompted you to transition. But with the intention to eventually get to where like starting to play with those categories on a societal level can perhaps destabilize even more one's relationship to their own self, their individuality, as opposed to the identity, and where that kind of gets scrambled.
Yep, totally agree. Yeah,
So
very.
if you want to, when did you start? How far did it go back with like confusion about gender or a desire to transition, and what kind of was the egg or the seed for that? Was it all the way back in childhood?
No, actually, well, let's start at childhood, and you keep me on course with this. Okay, so I had an awful childhood.
Mm.
I had a situation of a lot of physical violence, of being physically beaten by both of my parents. There was a lot of alcoholism on my father's side of the family, so I witnessed like some horrific violence there as well. Um, One of my father's brothers was a pedophile, and he sexually abused me as a young kid. Um, yeah, so my whole childhood was basically a train wreck. But I wasn't identifying it in any cross-sex manner. I wasn't going in my mother's clothing and wearing women's clothing. I had basically a normal childhood, other than the violence and the sexual abuse. So then, along comes the Army recruiters. They tested us. I think it was in like the 11th grade of high school, and they gave us the ASVAB testing, and I tested way up into officer territory. So they started hounding me to come in the military. I mean, I had this like Marine recruiter show up 5 times at my workplace, and to come in, and they called the house constantly. So we were basically dirt poor, so it made sense. I wasn't going into the military to man up or anything like that. It was totally an
A career path.
economics.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was yeah, get some training, see where it goes. And the first 4 years were pretty normal, but the thing with the military is I was exposed to a tremendous amount of pornography. So I like, give you an example. My first duty station in Germany. Okay, so the base exchange, what they call the PX or the BX, they rented triple X movies to soldiers. All the base bookstores, they were full of Hustler and Penthouse and We and every imaginable title. So I mean, it was just like a big culture of pornography, and I wasn't really sucked into it in the early years. But as I started getting into like a supervisor position and started having like tremendous amounts of responsibility, I started using pornography as a stress thing. It was kind of like I would come home from lunch and be sitting there using one of those 1980 something or early 90 something image viewers and hitting the space bar and flipping nudes across the screen. I was doing that at night. I was really heavy into porn. I was one of the early people on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
And
yeah,
in your mind now, looking back at that, you see it as a coping mechanism for the amount of stress that you were in. So,
totally. That
so it, like, could you describe that? Like it just removes you from. It's like an escapism kind of thing. It removes you from the mind thinking about your duties and to like kind of in this feedback circuit, or.
Yeah, it was something to escape into. Okay, so I'm military. I couldn't do drugs. That's off the table. I have the family history of alcoholism, and my wife does too. So both of us have no desire to ever be alcoholics. So I mean, a lot of folks in the military use alcohol as their stress outlet. That wasn't an option for me. But pornography was. And the more I went into it, the deeper down the rabbit hole I went. And I mean, I literally started falling into Blanchard's category of the autogynephilia thing.
Right.
I started fantasizing about myself as a woman.
Do you,
Yeah,
do you, was it a very steep descent, or like was it incremental and just got a little bit stronger over periods of time? And how long would you say it took for that autogynephilia to kind of emerge and become something that you participated in? Like how far along in the pornography as stress relief was that?
within a couple of years,
Okay.
within about a two year aspect of it. Yeah.
And was there an aspect of when you began to fantasize about yourself as a woman and participate in sexual fantasies and probably activities in that? Was there like another character that you formulated, or was it just you in the position or positionality of being a female, of being a woman? Was like there another identity that you began to sculpt, or was it principally just a sexual, fantasy and act?
I mean, I came up with names for myself. Like I would, consider myself as Lisa back then. So I did that. But, I mean, the Blanchard thing was a big piece of me desisting because it was me, getting honest with myself about what was going on. Because, like, I mean, I don't know if you've read that stuff, but like Blanchard talks about, like, I'm not like a gay man is attracted to men. They're attracted to men's bodies. That excites them. I I'm not attracted by that at all. I'm only attracted to the sex act itself with me as a woman, me playing the role as a woman. I don't care what the man looks like.
Hmm.
It's just the sex act itself.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the kind of the rabbit hole I went down.
Yeah. And how did it begin to ratchet up and spill over into your everyday life? I guess, like, when did you start to want to transition into a woman full time? And was it always a sexual component, or did it just kind of become more than just a sexual component and swell into an identity and a social identity?
No, it was always a sexual component. But it's, before we get to that moment, we have to balance this against the military background of the amount of stress this put me under because I served like prior to and during Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So I had like a double death sentence going on. Number one, I could be put out for being gay or homosexual, any of that sort of thing, and then number two, I could be put out on the transvestism side of the house under the sexual paraphilias.
Hmm.
So that was like an incredibly crushing thing to have to live with and serve a military career under. So, and another piece of that is part of the stress relief thing was, I would even though I knew this stuff was a death sentence, it was like I would do it almost wanting to get caught, almost wanting to get caught to end the pain.
Hmm.
So me going out and doing risky things like dressing up as a woman and going to an adult theater in Germany and letting men follow me and things like that. I mean I could have easily been caught, but like I said, but I did it anyway.
And
Um,
did the risk heighten the excitement, or, like you say, was it more about like trying to get help or trying to get recognized for some other pain that you had that you're acting out on?
I think at the time the risk actually heightened the excitement as well. Yeah, I think that's a fair analysis of that.
Mm-hmm.
But this stuff went on for a couple decades, and it's about 2010, 2011. Well, let's get back up a second. So I actually left the military in the year 2000, and I just kind of had a really bad decade of dealing with a lot of my mental health issues and not really making any progress with it. I left the military riddled with PTSD and anxiety problems, all sorts of issues. So I left in 2000, get to about 2010, 2011, and we had bought a home. It was fairly expensive, like $365,000, and it had a lot of construction problems. And I got into like this huge battle with the builder, and he was basically refusing to fix the house. You ever seen the movie Pacific Heights, where I think it's Michael Keaton? I think he like deconstructs the apartment or whatever.
I don't think I've ever seen that.
Yeah, you'd have to watch it. Well, I did that on steroids. I dug up the yard. This was a place that had a strict homeowners association. I dismantled the house. I dug up the yard. I did all this crazy stuff. I was hauling dirt by the dump truck full out of the front yard and dumping it across the street. And and the builder sued me for $3.5 million. Yeah, I mean it turned into that kind of a battle.
Okay.
And the I was fighting with the neighbors, because the neighbors were a lot of like active duty Navy officers, and all they wanted to do was live there and sell their house 3 years later for more than they bought it for. They didn't, want everybody to know about the construction problems in the neighborhood. So I'm fighting the builder, I'm fighting with the neighbors, and people are calling the cops on me, and I'm doing all this crazy stuff. And eventually, we all went to court, and the builder agreed to buy the house back. But I was a wreck.
Hmm.
I was all doped up on Xanax. Filling out one of the documents, I couldn't even remember how to make the letter G because I was so ate up on benzos at the time. And that was the start of my transition. So I popped out of this $3.5 million lawsuit. I ended up in a cabin in the woods in Western Maryland after living in hotels for 6 months, and my credit rating going to zero. And I'm like, okay, so what's wrong with you, Jamie? How did you, how did you get like this? And I start Googling things, and I come up, what comes up? Transsexualism. And I was like, it was sold to me as, this is your problem. You've always been, a male trapped in a woman's body, and if you acknowledge that and you transition, then your mental health will get better. So
Okay.
that's what I did. Yeah.
So you were kind of sold. This is kind of skeptic or cynical way of putting it, but you were sold a bill of goods. You were sold a path towards reconciliation with yourself if you went along this path.
Yeah, I mean, but this stuff was in writing. Okay, my informed consent document from the Veterans Affairs, it says that mental health improves with transition hormones.
So the VA recommends that as a path towards health. Then.
Yeah, they're saying that you get better mental health by this.
Hmm.
And I transitioned around the time too, where okay, so I guess are you familiar with the name Dr. Norman Speck?
That rings a bell, but could you detail him?
Speck is like the godfather of puberty blockers.
Okay.
He's the one who basically brought it into the country in 2007 and said this is a good idea of how we save trans kids. And like there was an article around that time frame was SPAC in it. I can send it to you later if you want to see it. It's on my Twitter feed. But SPAC is telling reporters like okay, what we're doing is we're curing bipolar disorder in these kids. They're coming in, they're depressed, they're anxious, they're cutting on themselves, they got bipolar disorder. We put them on puberty blockers and start calling them by the name they want, and all of a sudden they're cured. That's what I bought into.
Okay.
Well, you know what? In the end, I ended up with all the same problems I went into it with. I wasn't cured.
So there was a temporary lifting of your unhealthy state in pursuing transition. Did it release you from certain things, or did it give you another thing to focus on? Or
Well, the only thing it did release me on was I now had a license to wear women's clothing whenever I wanted.
okay.
I got to, instead of being an autogynephiliac person on the side, I got to live that fantasy.
Hmm.
Yeah. So basically, yeah, that's how that worked out.
And did you kind of slowly begin to incorporate being a woman into your life, or did you just convert overnight and present constantly, or was it kind
Well,
of a patchwork?
I jumped in like to both feet. I printed out documents from one of the VA medical centers up in Massachusetts, and I made an appointment with a mental health nurse practitioner. And I showed up with all these documents, and I was like, "You either put me on hormones today, or I go home and buy them off the internet." And she did it. She had never met me in her life, but I went in and made that threat to her, and bam, she wrote me a script for hormones. I started them that evening.
Okay.
Yeah, and I jumped right into electrolysis of getting my facial hair removed. Yeah, I didn't waste any time on it.
Was your end goal? This is a personal question. Was your end goal to be surgically altered, or were you satisfied with hormones?
At the time, I was going to get surgically altered because it was like I was sold this how do you put it? That basically all I had to do was switch over my hormone operating fuel from testosterone to estrogen, get these surgeries, and then I was the same woman as any other woman.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the way it's sold to you under the trans package.
And what was the effect of hormones on you and on your feelings and your body, and how was that?
Um, well, before we do that one, let's do one
Okay.
other piece. So what I never really had a problem with gender dysphoria up until that point.
Hmm.
Once I actually, was being recognized as a female, on a more formal basis, that really gave me a gender dysphoria problem. It was like, okay, so now I'm a female and I'm very much aware that I'm in a male body. Like one of the things I did was I took a pair of tweezers and removed every single facial hair on my face. That's like, you going in the bathroom and removing your whole beard with a pair of tweezers. That's how far I progressed to having gender dysphoria really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as the other effects of the hormones, I started getting the crying episodes because one of the things I've learned from the mental health pathway and the trans pathway is testosterone protects you in two ways. It keeps tears away on the mental health side, just like antidepressants do. And when once you strip away that testosterone, you're kind of defenseless.
Okay.
So I mean, you can just like cry at the drop of a hat. Yeah.
Hmm. And so, in a way, it gave you an even more direct access to psychological pain that you were experiencing and the stuff that was under the surface for you.
Yeah, because I was defenseless against it. Like all of my traumas that, testosterone had been hiding, I was totally exposed to.
Hmm.
I would get into an argument with my daughter and I would cry like a baby. Yeah, because it was just defenses stripped away.
Hmm. In in your life up till the moment that we're speaking about, did you ever have counseling that was able to help you deal with your traumatic childhood and then the trauma that you experienced in the military and the stress? Or were you kind of forced or only found the way to deal with it was through self-medication and self-therapy?
Well, there was like numerous instances where folks had put me on medications. They had put me on things like Xanax and antidepressants. One psychiatrist even put me on Safaris temporarily, which is a bipolar drug, but nobody ever gave me any therapy.
Hmm.
They just kept throwing meds at me. So by the time I went into transitioning as a female, yeah, I had never had any therapy.
This is probably a question for later, but in your experience, from your experience, have you found that there is a path for therapy that would have worked for you? Are you Do you find any value in therapy or psychology, or have you started to gravitate towards like some sort of reading regimen or thought process or spirituality even to help you cope?
Yeah, if there's a wake up call to all of this, it's me. Okay, because therapists should have stopped what everything that happened in my case. They should have analyzed why I was doing the things. If they had of, they would have found out that I was doing it for, autogynephilia reasons, that I was confusing sex stereotypes with me being a woman. Yeah, there's just the childhood sexual abuse piece. There's so many things that were red flags that would have stopped my transition, but because of the stigmatism against therapists not affirming people right away, and even the conversion therapy laws that scare therapists.
Hmm.
All those things were barriers to getting me help. Instead, everybody just blessed off and said, "Okay, fine, you're a woman. Here's your pills. Have a nice day."
Hmm. So you were basically left to your own devices then to discover how to deal with these things yourself. And then when you're on estrogen, you have even less defenses. You become like this waterbed of emotion, just sloshing around. And
Well, we shouldn't say I was by myself. I had all these folks in Reddit and YouTube and all these other nice places that were helping me, get into the mess I got into.
oh,
Like,
okay, so you were the internet kind of fueled and reinforced you.
yeah, the internet, I mean, is how I diagnosed myself as trans to begin with. And then, I started hanging out in Reddit and the Ask Transgender room and, watching the videos on YouTube. It really wasn't any different than what these 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old folks are doing. I was just doing it at a different age.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And then did the internet help you to go in the other direction, or start to cope with yourself in a different manner than through transgenderism?
You talking about on the desisting side of
Yeah, on
it?
the desistant side.
Yeah, I mean, I credit the feminists for helping me really discover, the things I was doing wrong. Because, like, one of those pieces in the DSM-5 under just gender dysphoria, talks about, one of the characteristics is that you believe you have the stereotypical feelings of the opposite sex. That nails me to a T. I would have thought, even though people don't see it in me, my own view of myself from my world is, like, yeah, okay, I sit down to pee, that makes me trans. I cry easy. That's a female trait. That's another thing that makes me trans.
Hmm.
I could just get down these check boxes and and tell myself all these reasons, that I was really a female and not a male. But no therapist, again, ever sat down and explored that stuff with me. But the feminists do, because they throw it in your face. You really can't ignore it as a trans person. And when somebody's telling you the truth, I'm not. My eyes are open to the truth, and that's why my transition as a female fell apart. Yeah.
Could you give us some examples of how, like, a feminist confronted you on these stereotypical behaviors, and how that kind of began to, I guess, give you another dysphoria that counteracted your gender dysphoria, perhaps?
Well, there's various pieces of that. Okay, so me becoming a transgender woman, I was gonna, I figured, okay, well, I might as well be an activist too. I'm retired on disability. I got nothing but time on my hands. So I'll join the rest of the trans women in beating up on these women. It's the trans women who defend the trans community. It's kind of a reverse stereotype thing. You would think that the men of the transgender community, the transgender men, the females to males, would be fighting the wars. Well, they're pretty silent on all this. It's the male to females that are protecting transgenderism, and I joined them in that. But then another piece of the pie is, I don't know if you've seen how what you're supposed to read and what you're not supposed to read is regulated. Like, have you ever been in Reddit and, like, you're not allowed to post articles from such and such place? Yeah, that sort of thing. Well, I don't like that. I like to have a wide variety of voices telling me, what's going on in the world. And I started reading things like, Kathy Brennan's Gender Identity Watch and Gallus Meg's Gender Trender, and seeing, eyes wide open, what was really going on with transgenderism. And I couldn't ignore that. I mean, it changed me. And I was like, I'm with them. I'm not with the trans women. These folks make more sense to me.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And so that was a piece of you desisting.
Yeah. That was a big piece of me desisting to non-binary.
Okay.
Yeah.
What are some of the other pieces then? And when you started to accept a different category other than woman, how did your mental health change, or how did your relationship to your mental health change?
I kept telling myself that all this stuff was going to help me, and there might be a placebo balance in some of it, but I always ended up back at square one of being mentally ill. Yeah,
Hmm.
I never got any relief. But there was like a bunch of tributaries flowing that towards me desisting, back to male altogether. One of the pieces was, I felt like I needed to set a better example for kids. I felt like I was just teaching them that you can just run off and hide under a different identity, and to escape your problems, and you can't. Yeah, that's not possible.
It sounds like that stereotype of the man who, just falls in love with another woman and then finds himself married to the same woman over and over and over again, or in the same broken relationship.
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy of it.
Hmm.
Yeah, so there was that piece of it. There was the fact that the whole thing was a fraud to begin with, because the judge having the transgender kid, that was like this anchor around my neck, where I felt like I had, like, stole that court victory because of that.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it was just like everything was just kind of crumbling. The realization that none of this had helped my mental health like I was promised. And I was like, I'm basically living as a male anyway, so why don't we just go ahead and make this official? Yeah.
And oh, so you went back to court to change your gender to male.
No, I still have to do that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I've got a real mess with that. So far, I've changed myself back to male at the Veterans Administration with DoD, Department of Defense. They were carrying me as a female because I'm a retiree, and I'm under their healthcare system as well. So I've changed myself back to male there. I've gotten a male driver's license. I've went to Social Security, but I still have to go back to court, and I've got to deal with my birth certificate
Hmm.
again. That was another crazy thing about. So it was like as soon as I had the big court victory, I had law firms popping up, LGBT types, and going like, "Hey, we would like to help you change your birth certificate." And I was born in Washington D.C., so I scored another big win by accepting their help. Even though this doesn't really get talked about, but I was the first person in Washington D.C. history to ever be issued a document that said something other than male or female.
Okay.
They changed my birth certificate to unknown. So I need to fix that. Yeah.
So in desisting, was there an aspect of that of becoming honest with yourself, and in the aspect of becoming honest with yourself and your state and your mental health, has it made it easier for you to find help that does actually help, or I guess a way of interacting with the world that actually does help you with your traumas?
Well, okay. Interacting with the world is a lot easier, doing it as my birth sex than running around as a fake woman or as a fake third gender. you know, I'm not fighting pronoun battles. I'm not battling over bathrooms. I'm just back to just being just your average white guy and nobody really pays any attention to going down the street now. Now, an interesting piece as far as like more professional help, the VA has kind of dumped me. I recently talked to them, reached out and said, I'm going to need some help, getting through this again. And they basically referred me to an outside therapist because I had approached them also and said, you've got my diagnosis wrong here. You shouldn't be carrying me as gender dysphoria when in reality, this is an autogynephilia problem and we need to get that changed. And they didn't seem very receptive to that.
Do you think that that's because they don't have they're not in a position to help you with that? They've been mandated to think of things in certain terms, and you're breaking the category for them?
Well, there's probably a better term for that. I would probably use something like medical malpractice because if you're diagnosing me with gender dysphoria and you're affirming me as a woman, and you don't know anything about Blanchard's theories on autogynephilia, yeah, that was like a seriously thing that went wrong in my transition.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So, in a certain respect, I can see that your story is going to have make some problems with certain aspects of the transgender activist community. So I think that it would be good, if you agree or not agree, or what are your
Hmm.
thoughts on this, to specify that your case isn't representative of all trans people. Or do you think, are you saying that trans is fictional, that non-binary is fictional, and we should really seriously question that? Or are you asking for more nuance in the way that we approach and diagnose this stuff?
I don't mince my words anymore on this. The
Okay.
the whole the whole I'm going to go ahead and cuss on this one. The whole shit show is a fraud. Academia folks who create things, like the folks behind gender identity and the folks behind gender. They're just like these folks in the DSM. Every time it comes out, they reach back through the decades and they've created this stuff. It's not real. This is this is worse than the lobotomy problem. We've harmed way more people with this gender dysphoria and gender identity thing than the lobotomy creators ever dreamed of harming. That's how far off we are on this. Yeah. So I
And
don't support any
okay,
of it.
that's your position.
Yeah, trans is fake. Sorry to hurt anybody's feelings, but yeah.
So with that said, then I guess you're willing to take the pushback for that. You're willing to stand your ground. And the question then is, how do you make a positive change to correct that mistake, if it is a mistake? In your mind, it's a mistake then.
This is a lot worse than turning around an aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf or something. This is going to take a lot of unwinding to fix it. So I'm just going to be, another one of those voices who stands up and says, this is what happened to me, and there's going to be some legal repercussions of this as well, because I'm going to get that court order revoked. I'm going back to court. I'm going to have them declare me as a male. I might even sue the Veterans Administration for medical malpractice at this point. But yeah, I mean, all these, the New York Times and those folks, they can all ignore it if they want. But I'm moving forward with this. Yeah.
In the note that you wrote me before we spoke, you talked about your allies now. So there's the whole trans allies, but now that there's a detrans allyship that you're mentioning, and one of the groups that was helpful for your desistance was feminists. It seems you mentioned the right, the conservatives, and the religious right. And what are your thoughts about becoming allied with these people, or even your trepidation, if you have any, of being used for other ends, used to maybe in the whole conversion therapy thing to allow parents to deconvert or try to convert their gay children, or foment more bigotry against the gay community? Do you see that as a problem, and do you see that as something that you need to speak out of?
Yeah, that's like a really big piece all at once. But
Yeah.
okay, so let's go into. I'm already aligned with the right and the religious folks, and I'll tell you why. I'm also very much aligned with the gender critical folks and the radical feminists, and I hope that they will open their eyes more to what the right is and the religious folks are doing to help us. So here's the thing. So like gender critical rad fems, what are their assets? I think like a military person. Okay, so they have some websites, okay, versus the Christians and the conservatives. They own television stations. They own massive websites.
Radio.
They are doing things to help us, and they're not. They're, at the same time, they're not criticizing us. They're not going like, here's Jamie Shupe. We wish he wasn't gay, but we're they're just helping me. They're not attaching any baggage or strings to this, and that's what the feminists need to see with this. They're setting aside the things about being gay and stuff like that, and they're like, okay, we're all going to work together on the trans problem, and we'll just put all that other baggage off to the side, and we'll fight over it another day. Let's fix this, and that's what's happening. So I'm with them 100%.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
And what are some of the things that, well, one, thanks for speaking and allowing me to showcase your story. And I've been, because I'm working on this story, I'm getting a lot of viewership from parents who are worried about their children, and probably some young people who are going through questioning and stuff. And I'm wondering what are some of the things that you can say to parents who are dealing with this problem, and how to support and yet challenge their children, and what are some of the things that you have to say to young people who are confused or questioning, I guess, is the not confused.
Well, to the young folks, like I said earlier, they really need to realize this whole thing is a fraud. Okay, this isn't going to end well, and altering, making, sterilizing your body, or making surgical changes to your body, in the long run, it's not going to solve your problem. So I wholeheartedly encourage them not to do that. I mean, I'm very fortunate that I never had any surgeries. I mean, I've certainly had some health complications from this, but yeah, I mean, nothing on the scale of folks who have had double mastectomies and vaginoplasties and all that stuff. So yeah, just kids, please don't do this. That's my advice. Now, the parents, my heart goes out to them because they are in such a bad position. What comes to mind is the mother the other day who in fact, this is a good plug for the conservatives on this. The Heritage Foundation published a essay by 5 parents of these kids, and one of the mothers said was, I've reached out to 100 reporters to tell this story, and not a single person would. But yet the Heritage Foundation stepped up and did. So that's that piece coming together.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, so I would encourage them to not transition their children to dig their heels in against that whole medical piece. All of it. None of it is really helpful in the end. But at the same time, they got to balance their kids harming themselves because suicide has been weaponized. You're as a transgender person, you're trained to play the suicide card. Every time you need to. Pronouns will kill you. That's the kind of thing that's going on with that.
And in your own dealing with your autogynephilia, and then your own trauma, like what are some of the resources that have helped you? It seems like activism is a way of you interacting with the world in a positive manner, and that might have some good benefits for your mental health. But what are some of the psychological tools that you've found, or schools of thought that you've found, whether it's like stoicism or spirituality, that have helped you deal with your mental problem and shift it from a gender issue into just you figuring out how to be in a better place?
The number one thing that has helped me is just being willing to open my eyes and learn my way out of this. If you're hanging out in Reddit and people are controlling what you are allowed to read and what you're allowed to think, and you have to, it's literally like being in a cult. Once you break the cult's hold on you, and you start teaching yourself what went wrong, then you start getting better. So that's really the number one thing that has helped me through all of this. Yeah.
And where are you going now? I mean, other than the legal stuff, like what are some of the projects that you're putting your energy into?
At the moment, I'm concentrating on writing my autobiography because I really need to capture this and let people see just how bad the whole thing was. And yeah, that's a big part of it. I continue to write essays for whichever websites are willing to publish them. Um, and I'm looking at I have to balance all this with my mental health, which is pretty fragile. But Walt, are you familiar with Walt Tyre?
No.
Walt Tyre is was I don't even have words for it. Walt went through a whole bunch of surgeries, and Walt is one of the early desisters. Walt was a male to female. Had breast augmentation, bottom surgery. Lived as a woman for like 8 years or so. And I mean, it's a real horror story with Walt's situation. And Walt has been doing this for like 20 years. And he's just been this, this voice in the wilderness that a lot of people haven't paid attention to, or the trans community ridicules him and they, write him off as a religious nut and all that. Well, Walt's getting to be about 80 years old now. So, people need to step forward and fill his shoes. Sure, there's a lot of the sister movement is more focused around the females to males. There's not a lot of support on the side of the house on the male to female side of it.
Why do you think that is? Because of stereotypes of men being able to handle it on their own, or?
Well, I think women are better at empathy too.
Or at inspiring empathy?
I mean, having empathy. Yeah. I mean, women are a lot better at that stuff than males are, and yeah, and they're much more supportive, and they're taking these harmed women into their arms and nursing them back.
So that makes me wonder if you're giving a shout out or a call out for men to support desisters too, especially men, or having some sort of men's group, positive masculinity or something like that. I don't know. What are you suggesting
You're
or
you're talking
saying that's needed?
you're speaking for me on that one. I
Okay,
mean,
yeah.
it's yeah. I mean, that's exactly what needs to happen. Yeah, we need to on the
Hmm.
men's side of the house. We need to start getting our act together, and we need to start being a lot more supportive to what Walt has been doing all these years.
Hmm.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, this stuff is probably to the point where support groups need to be created. Yeah, I mean, it's like it has to be built from the ground up.
That's a completely novel idea for me. I'd never even thought that that would be something that would be helpful and even necessary, though. So that's a very good point that you brought up. And do you see? I guess you made the analogy of turning around an aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf or some Gulf, and that the
Yeah,
momentum's really against us at this point, or not us, but against a change in the direction of what's happening on this front. So do you think that there's just a bunch of incremental small things that need to happen, or is there any other way?
yeah. I mean, it's going to be a whole bunch of small pieces that come together. But it's not uncommon for, say, like churches to have transgender support groups. I don't know whether you're aware of that or not. But like a lot of the PFLAG meetings I used to go to, they occurred in the basement of churches. Well, those same organizations maybe need to step up to the plate and start putting some resources together for desisters as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But yeah, the aircraft carrier thing, this is like the aircraft carrier towing the aircraft carrier, towing the aircraft carrier, and then turning it around. It's going to take a lot of work.
Hmm. I
And yeah, I mean, I like one of the things I said the other day, this looks like a lot like, how do you put it? Coming out of a war, people are really psychologically harmed. Some folks are missing body parts. And you know what? We're returning to an unsympathetic public.
hmm.
Yeah, because a lot of people don't like this whole thing to begin with. So for them to gather their empathy up for somebody who's been down this transgenderism path, yeah, it takes a lot for them to do that.
That seems like problems on many fronts because you're going to be ridiculed by the community that you're leaving. And even not just ridiculed, but people will actively go after you. I see a lot of problems with people hearing you say that the whole thing is a fiction. And that brings up whole questions about empathy and support and affirmation. But as well, like you bring up, like there's the public who is just say, well, I told you so. Fuck you, buddy. You just like sent my grandkids down this path now. So you're to blame. Reap what you sow. And so I don't think that's going to be helpful at all. And so there should be, it seems like there's a lot of work to do, a lot of PR.
But I'm not scared of this.
Hmm.
Yeah, I the feminists are over here, and the Christians and the right is over here. Yeah. So I don't care if they've got HRC or whoever they've got. I've got this army behind me too.
Huh. Well, wonderful, Jamie. I should go. I have another interview that I have to get ready for.
Yeah.
Is there any resources that you would like me to link to? Do you have a blog or an active website? You have a Twitter that you're using?
Yeah, I'm notable desister on Twitter, but I mean you can just plug my name into Google. Anybody could do that, and there's like there's a ton of stuff. I have a personal website on WordPress. Actually, that's even linked to my Wikipedia page. At the bottom of the Wikipedia page has my personal website. Yeah, Wikipedia. I don't think like to be desisting either, but yeah.
Hmm.
So yeah, I'm easy to find, and I have a contact form on my personal website, and of course, people can reach me through Twitter. Yeah.
Excellent.
But I appreciate you taking the time to bring me to your world.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks. We'll keep in touch and hopefully maybe I'll have you back on or hopefully we can keep a conversation going in some capacity, but absolutely contact me anytime.
Okay. Yeah, this thing isn't going away or anything. So you take care.
All right, Jamie. Have a good day.
All right. You too. Bye-bye.
Ciao.